Welcome to our Genocide Group project. Join us as we recount events from the rape of Nanjing. Our group members are Kaylin Martinez, Nadia Canella, Morgan Foster, and Nancy Chen.
Our thesis statement is the genocide occurred as a result of Japan's desire to achieve world domination.
Let's get started by reviewing key characteristics of the Japanese culture. Japanese upbringing was much different than the American childhood. Children were taught that their emperor was an almighty god who was destined to rule the world by divine rights. Playtime consists of wartime figurines such as toy soldiers and military paraphernalia. The desire to become a warrior who will die while serving the emperor was an ideology instilled during childhood. It was their duty to fight for Japan, conquer China, and to hate the Chinese. Japanese religious and cultural beliefs. Japanese society was required to display soldierly obedience. War was sacred in the way to glorify their God. To have unconditional loyalty to their emperor, and that dying for the emperor held the highest honor. These instilled Japanese principles provoked the genocide along with Japanese mission to expand control.
Expanding control over China was Japan's starting point to expanding control over Asia. The Chinese and Japanese were feuding before the Battle of Shanghai, starting with the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894. In 1905, Japan's economic and political interests grew in Manchuria. Japan victoriously seized Manchuria from China in 1931. To regain authority over the country, the Chinese government discontinued treaties with Japan, expelling Japanese settlers in Manchuria without reparation. Chinese forces continued to reject Japanese aggression in Manchuria, leading to the largest Asian war in the 20th century. Japan's attacks on Asian countries lasted for 51 years. The Japanese insisted that their mission to conquer Asia was different than other empires, an ideological way of strengthening shared Asian culture and to liberate Asia from Western imperialism. Events depicted throughout this presentation will show you that Japan's actions were deceptive and shameful as a representation of Asian culture. Japan plans expanded beyond Asia, ultimately achieving world domination. July of 1927, the Tanaka Memorial was given to the Japanese Emperor Hirohito. The Tanaka Memorial was a military plan to conquer the world, starting with Manchuria, China, all of Asia, India, Russia, Europe, and the rest of the world. Before we begin discussing events leading up to the Nanjing massacre, let's reflect on Chinese society before the war began.
Before the war, Chinese civilization was on the rise. Nanjing was the nation's capital and an ancient cultural and political center, filled with the most breathtaking architecture, surrounded by the largest city wall in the world. And in the early 20th century, electricity, paved highways, and automobiles was the way of life. Shanghai was the financial center of China, and the people of China had never invaded a foreign land. They were self-sufficient, and following Confucius' thoughts was a norm. We strongly encourage you to buckle up as we take you on an unprecedented journey through the rape of Nanjing. Nancy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nadia. Nationalist Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek was battling communist rural strongholds while war with Japan was imminent. By July 1937, Japan had expanded its forces in China, and on July 7th, the Marco Polo Bridge incident occurred when the Chinese and Japanese exchanged fire. The exact cause of this incident remains unknown. By August 13th, Japanese forces invaded Shanghai and the surrounding areas by land, sea, and air. The Japanese had brute military weapons while the Chinese only had small caliber weaponry. The Battle of Shanghai occurred in 3 phases. The first phase, from August 13th to August 22nd, resulted in mass civilian casualties. The second phase, from August 23rd to October 26th, was said to have been the bloodiest in and around Shanghai. The third phase, from October 27th through the end of November, is when the Chinese forces were retreating from Shanghai towards Nanjing. The battle crippled China's forces, though Japan also suffered losses. As the Japanese army began to approach Nanjing, many Westerners left the city. However, a small number of Western businessmen, journalists, and missionaries stayed behind and formed the International Committee for the Nanjing Safety Zone. The committee consisted of Casey Smythe, Edward Sperling, George Fish, and John Rabb. John Rabb, who was elected to lead the committee, was the leader of the local Nazi party and utilized his resources to secure funding and land to create the Nanjing Safety Zone, which was established just before the Japanese invasion of Nanjing. The Nanjing Safety Zone was a demilitarized zone established to protect civilians from Japanese slaughter, though many women and men were raped and killed. It's important to note, though, due to Rabb's efforts, some 250,000 people were protected in the Nanjing Safety Zone during the Nanjing Massacre. Over to you, Morgan.
Thanks, Nancy. The Nanking invasion was the beginning of a very devastating event. Nanking was bombed daily for over 100 days. Most bombs hit non-military targets such as the hospital. Chinese General Chiang Kai-shek questioned if they should attempt to defend Nanking. They believed it would be impossible. Chiang Kai-shek decided to do both. He fled with all of the top generals and left General Chiang in Nanking to defend it. 90,000 of his soldiers were young boys and farmers who had been forced at gunpoint to fight. When Chiang left, he took all of the communications with him, making it impossible for Chiang to talk to his troops. On December 10th of 1937, Chinese defenses started to crumble. December 11th, Japanese army advanced from suburbs into the city. Japanese immediately began firing on refugees, surrounding them with machine guns and killing them all. Tang received a message from Chiang that he should retreat, but he did not want to because he could not communicate with his troops. He eventually did leave with his officers. The now leaderless Nanking became a giant trap for Chinese soldiers and civilians within its walls. Roads and alleyways became washed with blood. The slaughter continued until not a soul could be found on the streets. December 17th, Japan formally entered Nanking. Japanese demanded that all Chinese soldiers surrender and offered them protection, but all were killed. Civilians who were in the streets were shot. Panic was spreading, but safety zones were filled. There was between 20,000 and 80,000 women of the ages 10 through 90 estimated to have been raped by Japanese soldiers. Japanese even cut off food supply to the safety zone to lure women out. Well over 250,000 women, children, soldiers, babies, and old men were mass murdered. Executions consisted of beheading, mass shootings, bayonet practice, buried alive, burned alive, and hung by tongues. There were so many bodies in the streets that international relief agencies begged the Japanese for permission to remove them. Japanese refused and said the bodies were to stay so they could further terrorize the Chinese. When not raping or killing, Japanese were looting and burning what remained of the city. All of this was done with the royal stamp of approval. Hirohito, the Japanese emperor, congratulated his 3 generals for the torture of Nanking. On to you, Caitlin.
Death toll and war crimes. Although there is no official known number, it is believed that the death toll is around 300,000. The Japanese claimed the number of deaths was as few as 6,000, which has since been discredited due to the destruction of Japanese military records after their surrender in 1945. Shortly after the surrender of Japan, the primary officers in charge of the Japanese troops at Nanjing were put on trial. This included Matsui Iwane, who was charged for deliberately and recklessly ignoring his legal duty, as well as Tani Hisao, a lieutenant general who had personally participated in acts of murder and rape. They were both found guilty of war crimes by the International Military Tribunal for the Far East and were executed. Although these 2 were held accountable for their horrific actions, there were many Japanese military leaders who were not. The lack of accountability is something that we can see today on Japan's side. Lasting effects. The rape of Nanjing is described to be one of the most brutal and forgotten genocides of the 20th century. To this day, the Japanese have not acknowledged the genocide. In September of 1968, the Japanese Education Minister Fujio Matsuyuki described the raping of Nanjing as just another part of the war, clearly trying to downplay the seriousness of it. Instead of learning from past mistakes and crimes, Japan hides it, or even worse, tries to deny it. By doing so, it creates tension within the Chinese and Japanese relationship, and it prevents Japan's younger generation from understanding the full implication of their country's role in World War II. The Japanese turned murder into a sport. They killed people in such inhumane ways. It took years for both the Chinese people and the city to recover from the rape of Nanjing. Over 80 years later, there is still long-lasting tension between both countries. China wants the apology they deserve, while Japan wants to forget, and many Japanese nationalists even deny that the genocide ever occurred. Today, people who lived through this horrific event are left with stories full of tragedy and many with a long-awaited apology. In conclusion, the genocide occurred because of Japan's desire for world domination.
This concludes our group genocide presentation. Displayed on this screen is our group works cited information.